My name is Marlon, and I am 58 years old. I am standing in the rain outside my son's house, holding a suitcase that contains everything I own. 48 hours ago, I had a construction company, a home, and a future. Now I have nothing but the clothes on my back and the hope that my only child will open his door. But when that door finally opens, it is not my son standing there. It is his wife. And what she says next changes everything. Before I share what happened, let me know where you are watching from today. Drop your location in the comments below. If stories about family betrayal and finding your way back from rock bottom speak to you, hit that like button and subscribe to join this community. Now let me take you back to where it all began. I grew up in a small town in rural Ohio, the kind of place where everybody knew everybody and nobody had much of anything. My father worked in the coal mines, coming home every evening, covered in black dust, his lungs slowly filling with the poison that would eventually kill him. My mother worked at the local laundromat, folding other people's clothes for minimum wage, her hands always red and cracked from the harsh detergents. We lived in a 2-bedroom house with a leaky roof and a furnace that quit working every winter. I shared a room with my younger sister, and we slept under 3 blankets each just to stay warm during those bitter Ohio nights. We did not have much, but we had each other, and my parents made sure we never went to bed hungry, even if it meant they sometimes did. My father was a proud man. He believed that a man's worth was measured by how hard he worked and how well he provided for his family. He never complained about the 12-hour shifts underground. He never talked about the coughing fits that got worse every year. He just showed up day after day because that is what a man does. When I was 17, the mines finally took him. His lungs gave out on a Tuesday morning in February. I remember sitting in the hospital waiting room, watching my mother's face crumble as the doctor delivered the news. In that moment, I stopped being a boy and became the man of the house. I dropped out of high school the next week. There was no discussion, no debate. My mother needed help, my sister needed food and clothes for school, and I needed to step up. I found work at a construction site on the outskirts of town, carrying lumber and mixing concrete for $4 an hour. The work was brutal. My hands bled for the first month until the calluses formed. My back ached so badly some nights that I could not sleep. But I kept showing up just like my father taught me. The older workers took pity on me. They saw a skinny kid with tired eyes and a desperate need to learn, and they taught me everything they knew. Frank Morrison, a carpenter with 40 years of experience, showed me how to read blueprints. Eddie Sanchez, a master electrician, taught me the basics of wiring. Bill Thompson, a plumber who had worked on some of the biggest projects in the state, explained the mysteries of pipes and pressure. I absorbed everything like a sponge. I stayed late after my shifts ended, watching the skilled tradesmen work, asking questions until they got tired of answering. I read books from the library about construction management, about running a business, about leadership. I had a vision forming in my mind even then. Someday I would not just work for a construction company. I would own one. By the time I was 25, I had worked my way up to foreman. I was managing crews twice my age, earning their respect through sheer competence and an unwillingness to ask anyone to do something I would not do myself. I saved every penny I could, living in a tiny apartment and driving a truck that should have been junked years earlier. At 28, I took the leap. I partnered with 2 friends from the job site, pooled our savings, and started our own company. We called it Morrison Brothers Construction, named after Frank Morrison, the old carpenter who had taught me so much. Frank had passed away the year before, and I wanted to honor his memory. Those early years were the hardest of my life. We worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week. We bid on jobs nobody else wanted, the small projects that barely covered costs but kept us going. I remember one stretch where I worked 32 days straight without a single day off. My hands were permanently calloused, my back permanently ached, but I did not care. I was building something. Slowly, things improved. We earned a reputation for quality work and honest dealing. Clients started coming to us instead of us chasing them. We hired our first employees, then our second, then our 10th. By the time I was 30, Morrison Brothers Construction was a real company with real prospects. That was also the year I met Linda. She was a nurse at Pittsburgh General Hospital. I had gone in for stitches after a piece of rebar sliced my arm open on a job site. She was the one who cleaned my wound and sewed me back together, scolding me the whole time for not wearing proper protective gear. Linda was everything I was not. She was educated, refined, cultured. She had grown up in a nice house with parents who had never worried about where the next meal was coming from. She read poetry and listened to classical music and knew which fork to use at fancy restaurants. By all logic, she was out of my league. But somehow she saw something in me. Maybe it was my determination or my work ethic, or just the way I looked at her like she was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. Whatever it was, she agreed to go on a date with me, and then another, and then another. 2 years later, I asked her to marry me, and she said yes. We got married in a small ceremony at her parents' church. I wore a rented suit that did not quite fit right, and she wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her perfectly. When she walked down that aisle toward me, I felt like the luckiest man in the world. We bought a modest house in the suburbs of Pittsburgh. It was nothing fancy, just 3 bedrooms and a small yard, but it was ours. Every nail in that house meant something to me. Every payment was a victory. 2 years into our marriage, Linda told me she was pregnant. I still remember the moment she showed me the positive test. I picked her up and spun her around the kitchen, both of us laughing like children. I was going to be a father. Derek was born on a crisp October morning. When the nurse placed him in my arms for the first time, I made a silent promise. This boy would never know the kind of hardship I had known. He would never go to bed hungry or cold. He would have every opportunity I never had. I would work my fingers to the bone to make sure of it. And I did. Oh, how I worked. The years that followed were a blur of job sites and business meetings and late nights reviewing contracts. Morrison Brothers Construction grew and grew. We went from 10 employees to 20, then 30, then 40. We built shopping centers and apartment complexes and office buildings. My name became known in the Pittsburgh construction community. People respected me. But through it all, I never forgot my priorities. Every morning before work, I made Derek breakfast. Pancakes on Saturdays, eggs and bacon on Sundays, whatever he wanted during the week. Every evening, no matter how tired I was, I helped him with his homework. I coached his little league baseball team. I took him camping in the summer and taught him to fish in the same stream where my father had once taught me. Linda and I were a team. She handled the home front while I handled the business. She was the one who remembered parent-teacher conferences and doctor appointments and birthday parties. She was the one who turned our house into a home. I was the one who made sure there was always money in the bank to pay for everything. We had a good life. A really good life. Then, when Derek was 14, everything changed. Linda had been feeling tired for months. We both chalked it up to the demands of raising a teenager, of keeping up with a busy household. But when she started losing weight without trying, when she found a lump in her breast. During a routine self-examination, we both knew something was wrong. The diagnosis was breast cancer stage 3. The doctors said they would do everything they could, but their eyes told a different story. I watched my wife, my partner, my best friend, wage a war against her own body for 2 long years. I held her hand through chemotherapy sessions that left her weak and sick. I held her hair back when she vomited. I told her she was beautiful when she lost all her hair, because she was. She was always beautiful to me. She died on a Sunday morning in spring when the flowers were just starting to bloom in the garden she had planted. Derek and I were both holding her hands when she took her last breath. She was 44 years old. I wanted to fall apart. I wanted to crawl into bed and never get up again. But I had a son who needed me, a business that depended on me, and a wife who had made me promise in her final days that I would take care of our boy. So I did what I had always done. I showed up. Day after day, I showed up. I learned to cook more than just breakfast. I learned to do laundry without turning all the white clothes pink. I learned to braid my niece's hair so I could practice for when Derek brought a girlfriend home someday. I learned to talk about feelings, which was not something that came naturally to a man like me. Derek and I grew closer in those years after Linda's death. We were all each other had. Every night we ate dinner together at the kitchen table. Every weekend we did something together, just the two of us. Fishing trips, baseball games, drives out to the countryside to look at the changing leaves. I tried to be both mother and father to him, and while I know I could never fully replace Linda, I gave it everything I had. When Derek graduated high school, I was so proud I could barely speak. He had gotten into a good university, a private school with a strong business program. The tuition was more than I had ever imagined paying for education, but I did not hesitate. I sold my old truck, the one I had been driving for 15 years, and used the money for his first year's tuition. When Derek graduated college with honors, I sat in the audience and cried. Not sad tears, but happy ones. My boy had made it. He had a degree, of future opportunities I could never have dreamed of at his age. Everything I had worked for, every sacrifice I had made, had led to this moment. Derek got a job at a big bank in Philadelphia. He was climbing the corporate ladder, making a name for himself in the financial world. I was so proud of him, I told everyone who would listen. My son, the banker. My son, the college graduate. My son, the success story. Then he met Stephanie. Stephanie came from money. Her father, Raymond, owned a chain of car dealerships across Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Her mother was a socialite who sat on the boards of various charities and spent her weekends at country clubs. They lived in a mansion in one of Philadelphia's most exclusive neighborhoods and drove cars that cost more than my first house. I will admit I was intimidated when I first met them. But Raymond turned out to be a good man, the kind who had not forgotten his humble beginnings. He had started with a single used car lot and built an empire through hard work and smart decisions. He and I understood each other, spoke the same language of sweat and sacrifice. Stephanie was polite to me at first. She called me Mr. Evans and smiled when I told stories about Derek's childhood. But there was something in her eyes, a kind of calculation, that made me uneasy. She was always measuring, always assessing. I got the feeling she saw people in terms of their usefulness, their status, their net worth. I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe I was being too suspicious. Maybe she was just nervous around her future father-in-law. Maybe she really did love my son for who he was, not what he could provide. The wedding was the most expensive thing I had ever been a part of. Stephanie wanted a fairy tale, and her parents were happy to provide it. But I was the one who paid for the rehearsal dinner, the flowers, the honeymoon to Europe. I was the one who bought them their first house as a wedding gift, a beautiful 3-bedroom colonial in a nice neighborhood. I did not mind. That is what fathers do. They provide. They sacrifice. They give everything they have to see their children happy. I thought I had done everything right. I thought my family was secure, my legacy assured. I thought the bond between father and son was unbreakable. I was wrong. The deal seemed perfect on paper. Too perfect, I should have realized in hindsight. Marcus Webb approached me at a construction industry conference in downtown Pittsburgh. He was a smooth talker, the kind of man who made you feel important just by talking to you. He wore expensive suits and a gold watch that probably cost more than my truck. He represented a real estate development company that was planning to build a luxury condominium complex on the outskirts of the city. $12 million. That was the price tag for the project. It would be the biggest contract Morrison Brothers Construction had ever landed, the kind of job that would cement our reputation and secure our future for years to come. I did my due diligence. I checked references, reviewed financial statements, talked to other contractors who had worked with Webb's company. Everything checked out. Marcus Webb was a respected name in the real estate world. His company had completed dozens of successful projects across the region. There was no reason to doubt him. We signed the contract on a Thursday afternoon in his office, surrounded by lawyers and witnesses and stacks of paperwork. I remember shaking his hand afterward, feeling like I was standing on the threshold of a new era for my company. The project required significant upfront investment. Materials, equipment, labor costs. My company did not have enough liquid capital to cover everything, so I did something I had never done before. I took out a loan against my house, the house Linda and I had lived in for nearly 30 years. $3 million secured by everything I owned. It was a calculated risk, the kind of decision business owners have to make sometimes. The profits from the project would more than cover the loan. Within 2 years, I would be debt-free and sitting on a pile of cash. It was simple math. The first 6 months went smoothly. We broke ground, laid the foundation, started building the framework. My crews worked hard, and I was on site every day, overseeing every detail. The building was going to be magnificent, a testament to everything I had built over 32 years in this business. Then the payments started slowing down. At first, Marcus had excuses. The bank was processing the transfer. There was a paperwork issue that needed to be sorted out. His accountant was on vacation. I had heard similar stories before in my career. Construction financing was complicated. Delays happened. I was frustrated, but not alarmed. Then the payments stopped entirely. I called Marcus's office repeatedly. His secretary always had a new excuse. He was in a meeting. He was traveling. He would call me back. He never did. After 3 weeks of this runaround, I drove to his office personally. The building was locked. The windows were dark. A notice was taped to the front door. Eviction for non-payment of rent. I felt the first real stirrings of panic. I contacted a lawyer who started digging into Marcus Webb's affairs. What he found made my blood run cold. Marcus Webb was a con artist. The real estate development company was a shell corporation with no real assets. The financial statements he had shown me were forgeries. The references I had called were plants, friends of his, pretending to be satisfied clients. The entire thing from start to finish was an elaborate fraud, and I was not the only victim. There were a dozen other contractors just like me, all of whom had invested heavily in Marcus Webb's phantom projects. The total amount stolen was estimated at over $50 million. Marcus Webb had vanished. Some said he fled to South America. Others said he was hiding somewhere in Europe. The FBI was involved now, but they warned me not to expect much. Recovering stolen assets in cases like this was extremely difficult. The money was probably already laundered and long gone. I was ruined. My company could not pay its workers. One by one, my loyal employees started leaving, not because they wanted to, but because they had families to feed and bills to pay. I could not blame them. I could only watch helplessly as everything I had built over 3 decades crumbled around me. The bank was not sympathetic. A loan was a loan. A contract was a contract. They did not care that I had been swindled by a professional criminal. They only cared that I could not make my payments. I sold everything I could. Equipment, vehicles, tools. I held garage sales and auctions and liquidation events. I took every bit of cash I could scrape together and threw it at the mountain of debt, but it was like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. The foreclosure notice arrived on a gray morning in November. I stood in my kitchen, the kitchen where Linda and I had shared thousands of meals, where I had made Derek pancakes every Saturday morning, where I had taught my son to tie his shoes and ride a bike. I held that piece of paper in my hands and felt something inside me break. They gave me 30 days to vacate. 30 days to pack up 30 years of memories. 30 days to say goodbye to the only home my family had ever known. I walked through the rooms, slowly touching the walls, remembering. Here was the spot where Derek had taken his first steps. There was the window seat where Linda used to sit and read her romance novels. That was the crack in the ceiling that I had always meant to fix but never got around to. On the last day, a man from the bank came to supervise the final walkthrough. He was young, probably not much older than Derek, with a clipboard and an expression of professional indifference. He did not care that this house held my whole life inside its walls. To him, it was just another property to be processed. I watched them put the seal on the front door. The seal that meant I could never enter again. The seal that meant this was no longer my home. I had one suitcase. Inside it were some clothes, a few photographs, and Linda's wedding ring. Everything else, a lifetime of possessions, had been sold or left behind or thrown away. 58 years of living reduced to a single suitcase. My neighbors watched from their windows as I walked to my truck. Some of them waved sadly. Others pretended not to see. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly widow who lived next door, came out and hugged me, pressing a $100 bill into my hand that I tried to refuse, but she insisted. Her kindness made me want to cry, but I held it together. A man does not cry in public. I sat in my truck for a long time, staring at the house that was no longer mine. Then I started the engine and drove away. Where would I go? I had no savings left. No property. No job. I was 58 years old with nothing but a suitcase and a truck that was nearly out of gas. There was only one place I could think of. One person who I believed would never turn me away. My son. I pointed the truck toward Philadelphia and started driving. It was a 4-hour trip longer with the traffic. The whole way I rehearsed what I would say. I was not going to ask for charity. I just needed a place to stay for a few days, maybe a week or two, while I figured out my next move. Derek would understand. He was my son. My flesh and blood. Family. By the time I reached Philadelphia, it was evening. The rain had started somewhere around Harrisburg and had gotten steadily heavier as I drove east. Now it was coming down in sheets, turning the streets into rivers and the sky into a solid wall of gray. Derek's house was in a nice neighborhood, the kind with manicured lawns and expensive cars in the driveways. I had been here before for holidays and special occasions. The house looked different in the rain, though. Darker, somehow. Less welcoming. I parked at the curb and sat for a moment, gathering my courage. Then I grabbed my suitcase from the back seat, pulled my jacket over my head, and ran for the front door. I was soaked by the time I reached the porch. I stood there dripping, feeling the cold seep into my bones, and pressed the doorbell. Footsteps inside. A shadow moving behind the frosted glass. The click of a lock disengaging. The door opened. Stephanie stood in the doorway, her silhouette backlit by the warm glow of the foyer. She was wearing expensive loungewear, the kind that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. Her hair was perfect, her makeup immaculate. She looked like she had just stepped out of a magazine. She did not invite me in. Instead, she looked at me from head to toe, taking in my wet clothes, my old suitcase, my dripping hair. Her expression was not hostile exactly. It was worse than that. It was dismissive. The way someone might look at a stray dog that had wandered onto their porch. I cleared my throat. Water dripped from my nose. I asked if Derek was home. Stephanie did not answer my question. Instead, she told me that Derek had informed her about my situation. She said they had discussed it. I felt a tiny spark of hope. They had discussed it. That meant they had talked about how to help me. Maybe they had prepared a guest room. Maybe they had some plan in place. Then she said the words that shattered that hope into a million pieces. She said I could not stay there. I stood there in the rain, trying to process what she had just said. Surely I had misheard. Surely she could not mean what I thought she meant. I asked her to repeat herself. Her voice was cold and clear when she spoke again. She said that this was her house. She said she would not have a bankrupt old man living under her roof. She said I would bring bad luck. Bad luck. That was how she described me. A bad luck charm. An omen of misfortune. Something to be avoided, like walking under a ladder or breaking a mirror. I could not speak. My mouth opened, but no words came out. 32 years of building a company. Thousands of hours of sacrifice. Hundreds of thousands of dollars spent on my son's education, his wedding, his house. All of it dismissed as bad luck. Then I saw movement behind Stephanie. A familiar shape, a familiar face. My son. Derek stood a few feet behind his wife, half hidden in the shadows of the hallway. He was looking at the floor, his hands shoved in his pockets. He would not meet my eyes. I called his name. I asked him if he was going to let his wife talk to me like that. He looked up briefly, then looked away again. He said that Stephanie was right. He said this was not a good time. He said they had their own problems. Their own problems. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to scream. What problems could they possibly have that compared to mine? They had a beautiful house in a beautiful neighborhood. They had high-paying jobs and expensive cars and vacations to tropical islands. What did they know about real problems? But I did not say any of that. I just stood there, rain pouring down my face, and looked at my son. My only child. The baby I had held in my arms 58 years ago and promised to protect. The boy I had raised single-handedly after his mother died. The young man I had given everything to, expecting nothing in return except love. Derek would not look at me. He stared at the floor, at the walls, at anything except his father standing broken and dripping on his doorstep. Then Stephanie spoke again. She said that Derek would offer me some money for a hotel, just for a few nights. For a moment I thought maybe I had been too harsh in my judgment. Maybe they really were trying to help in their own limited way. But Derek did not reach for his wallet. He did not make any move at all. He just stood there frozen like a statue. Then Stephanie added that actually no. She said they were not giving me any money. She said I would just waste it. Something broke inside me then. The last fragile thread of hope, the last shred of belief that my son loved me, snapped clean in two. I looked at Derek one more time, giving him a final chance to speak up, to defend me, to show that he was the man I had raised him to be. He said nothing. I nodded slowly. I picked up my suitcase. I turned around and walked back out into the rain. Behind me, I heard the door close. I heard the lock click into place. The sound was final, absolute. A period at the end of a sentence. A door closing not just on a house, but on a relationship. I walked back to my truck in a daze. The rain soaked through my clothes, but I barely noticed. I was too busy replaying the scene in my head, trying to understand what had just happened. My son had rejected me. My own flesh and blood had left me standing in the rain like a stranger begging for scraps. After everything I had done for him. After all the years of sacrifice and love and devotion. This was how he repaid me. I sat in my truck for a long time watching the rain stream down the windshield. I did not know where to go. I did not know what to do. For the first time in my adult life, I was completely and utterly lost. The first night I slept in my truck. I parked in a rest stop outside the city, reclined the seat as far as it would go, and tried to get some sleep. The rain drummed on the roof all night long, a constant reminder of the storm that had swept through my life and left nothing standing. I woke up stiff and sore, my back screaming in protest. I was too old to be sleeping in cars, but I did not have any other options. I had about $200 in my pocket. Mrs. Patterson's 100 plus some cash I had scrounged from various sources. It was enough for food and gas, but not much else. A cheap motel would burn through it in a matter of days. I needed to make it last. So I drove back into the city and found a church that served free meals. I had seen places like this before, usually in passing, never thinking I would need them. Now I stood in line with dozens of other lost souls waiting for a bowl of soup and a piece of bread. The shame was overwhelming. Here I was, Marlon Evans, owner of Morrison Brothers Construction, standing in a soup line like a vagrant. If my employees could see me now, if my competitors could see me now, if Linda could see me now. But I swallowed my pride and took my tray. I sat at a long table next to a man with a matted beard and a woman with hollow eyes. I ate my soup and bread in silence, trying not to make eye contact with anyone. After the meal, a volunteer approached me. She was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She asked if I needed a place to stay. I admitted that I did. She explained that the church had a small shelter attached to it. Nothing fancy, just cots in a big room, but it was warm and dry. They could accommodate me for a few nights if I needed. I thanked her and accepted. What choice did I have? The shelter was exactly as she described. A large room filled with cots, each separated by a few feet of space. The smell was a mixture of sweat and industrial cleaner. The sounds were a symphony of coughs and snores and quiet weeping. I lay on my cot that night staring at the water-stained ceiling and thought about how far I had fallen. 48 hours ago, I had a house, a company, a future. Now I was sharing a room with 30 strangers, all of us united by nothing except our misfortune. The man on the cot next to mine introduced himself as George. He was maybe 10 years younger than me, with a weathered face and calloused hands that spoke of a life of physical labor. He asked what had brought me here. I gave him the short version. Business failed. Lost my house. Nowhere to go. George nodded sympathetically. He had heard variations of this story many times before. He told me his own story. He had been a mechanic, owned his own shop. Then his wife got sick and the medical bills piled up. Then his wife died and he started drinking. Then he lost the shop and the house and everything else. I asked him how long he had been at the shelter. He said 3 years. 3 years. The number hit me like a punch to the gut. 3 years of soup lines and cots and charity. 3 years of being invisible, forgotten, discarded. Was this my future now? Was this where the story of Marlon Evans ended? I told myself no. I told myself that this was temporary, a brief stop on the road to recovery. I would get back on my feet. I would rebuild. I would show my son and his wife that I was not some piece of bad luck to be avoided. I was a fighter. I had survived poverty as a child, the death of my wife, the collapse of my business. I would survive this too. But late at night, lying awake on that thin cot surrounded by the sounds of other broken people, it was hard to believe my own promises. The next few weeks were a blur of survival. I looked for work, any work, but the economy was tough and jobs were scarce. Who wanted to hire a 58-year-old man with no references and no recent employment history? I filled out applications at fast food restaurants and grocery stores and gas stations. Most of them never called back. I tried to call Derek several times. I wanted to give him a chance to apologize, to explain, to make things right. The phone rang and rang, but no one answered. Eventually, I started getting a message saying the number was not available. He had blocked me. My own son had blocked my phone number. I sent letters to his house. Handwritten letters, the kind I had not written since I was courting Linda. I poured my heart out on those pages. I told him how much I loved him. I told him I was not angry, just hurt. I told him I understood if he could not take me in, but please, could we at least talk? The letters came back unopened. Return to sender. The address was correct. He had simply refused to accept them. I tried one more time sending a letter by certified mail, the kind that requires a signature. That one came back too, marked as refused. The message was clear. Derek wanted nothing to do with me. I cannot describe the pain of that realization. It was not like the pain of losing Linda, which was sharp and immediate and overwhelming. This was different. This was a slow ache, a hollow feeling in my chest that never went away. Every morning I woke up with it. Every night I fell asleep with it. The knowledge that my son, the person I had loved more than life itself, had cut me out of his world like a tumor. Then one day at the shelter, I ran into a familiar face. His name was Harold, and I had known him decades earlier, back when I was just starting out in construction. He had worked for a rival company, and we had crossed paths at various job sites over the years. He was a good man, honest and hard-working. I had lost touch with him after Linda died, too consumed with grief and single parenthood to maintain old friendships. Harold recognized me immediately. He seemed surprised to see me in a place like this. I gave him the abbreviated version of my story, and his face darkened with sympathy. Then he told me something that made my blood boil. He said he had seen Derek recently. Not in person, but on social media. A mutual acquaintance had shown him the pictures. I did not have a smartphone or a Facebook account. Such things had always seemed unnecessary to me. But Harold had both, and he offered to show me what he had seen. I almost refused. Part of me did not want to know. But curiosity got the better of me, and I agreed. Harold pulled out his phone and navigated to Derek's profile. There in full color was my son's life laid out for the world to see. The first picture showed Derek and Stephanie standing in front of a house. Not the house I had bought them as a wedding gift. A new house. A bigger house. The caption said they had just closed on their dream home. Price tag, according to Harold's research, $800,000. The next picture showed Derek at work, grinning broadly. The caption announced his promotion to senior vice president. A corner office with a view of the Philadelphia skyline gleamed behind him. Then there were vacation pictures. Derek and Stephanie on a beach somewhere tropical. The white sand, the blue water, the expensive resort in the background. They looked happy, carefree, without a worry in the world. I scrolled through picture after picture, each one a knife in my heart. My son was thriving. My son was succeeding. My son was living his best life while his father slept on a cot in a homeless shelter. Then I saw a picture that made me stop breathing. It was a family photo. Derek and Stephanie in the center. Stephanie's parents on one side beaming with pride. On the other side, no one, an empty space where a father should have been. The caption read, "Family is everything." I stared at those words until they blurred. Family is everything. But apparently I was not family, I was not everything, I was nothing. An erased presence, a deleted file, a blank space in the family portrait. Harold put his hand on my shoulder. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say. I handed back his phone and walked away. I needed to be alone. I needed to process what I had just seen. That night, I did not sleep at all. I lay on my cot and stared at the ceiling and thought about the last 26 years. All the sacrifices, all the love, all the hope and pride and joy I had invested in my son. And this was the return on that investment. Abandonment, rejection, erasure. Why, that was the question that tortured me. Why had Derek become this person? Where had I gone wrong? Had I been too lenient with him, too demanding, too absent, too present? I replayed every moment of his childhood, looking for clues, for warning signs, for the exact point where everything went sideways. I could not find it. As far as I could tell, I had done everything right. I had loved him unconditionally. I had provided for him generously. I had supported him through every challenge and celebrated every success. I had been the best father I knew how to be, and none of it had mattered. The weeks turned into months. Winter came and went. I was still at the shelter, still looking for work, still trying to put the pieces of my life back together. Then one day, a letter arrived for me. It was delivered to the church, addressed to Marlon Evans in care of the shelter. The handwriting on the envelope was elegant, flowing clearly, the work of someone with education and breeding. The return address was in Philadelphia. The name above it was Raymond Mitchell. Raymond, Stephanie's father, the car dealership king. The man I had come to respect and even like during the few times we had met. I opened the letter with trembling hands. It was an invitation. Raymond was turning 70 years old, and he was throwing himself a birthday party at his estate in the suburbs of Philadelphia. He wanted me to be there. The letter was brief but warm. Raymond said he had heard about my situation through the grapevine. He said he was sorry for what had happened to me. He said he considered me a friend and would be honored by my presence at his celebration. At the bottom of the letter, in a postscript, he added something that surprised me. He said he knew how his daughter and son-in-law had treated me. He said he did not approve. He said he hoped I would give him a chance to make it right. I read that letter 5 times, trying to understand what it meant. Raymond knew. He knew what Derek and Stephanie had done, and he disapproved. That alone was a small comfort. But should I go? That was the question. Part of me wanted to stay away to avoid any possibility of seeing Derek and Stephanie again. The wounds were still too fresh, the pain too raw. Harold, who had become something of a friend during my months at the shelter, encouraged me to attend. He said I needed to face them, to show them that I was not defeated, to reclaim some small piece of my dignity. He had a point. Running away would only make me feel worse. And besides, Raymond had specifically invited me. He wanted me there. That meant something. I did not have much in the way of formal attire. My old suits had been sold or left behind long ago. But I found a thrift store that sold gently used clothing, and I managed to put together a respectable outfit. A dark suit, a little worn at the cuffs, but clean and well pressed. A white shirt. a blue tie. I looked at myself in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back at me. Thinner, grayer, older, but still standing. The party was held at Raymond's estate, a sprawling property with manicured grounds and a house that looked more like a hotel than a home. I arrived by bus, a 2-hour trip from the city, and walked the last mile from the bus stop. By the time I reached the gates, my feet were aching, but I did not care. A security guard checked my name against a list and waved me through. I walked up the long driveway past luxury cars and well-dressed guests feeling utterly out of place. But I kept my head high. I had been invited. I belonged here as much as anyone. The party was already in full swing when I entered the main hall. Hundreds of guests mingled and chatted, holding champagne flutes and nibbling on canapés. A live band played jazz in one corner. Waiters circulated with trays of hors d'oeuvres. Everything was elegant, tasteful, expensive. I saw Stephanie before she saw me. She was holding court near the fireplace, surrounded by a group of equally polished women. Her dress was probably worth more than everything I owned. Her jewelry sparkled in the chandelier light. She looked like royalty. Then she turned and noticed me. Her face went through a rapid series of transformations. Surprise, confusion, displeasure. Then a forced smile that did not reach her eyes. She said something to her companions and started walking toward me. But before she could reach me, someone else intercepted. Raymond Mitchell appeared at my side, his weathered face split by a genuine grin. He grabbed my hand and shook it warmly. He told me how glad he was that I had come. He said I looked good. He put his arm around my shoulders and steered me toward a table near the front of the room, the table reserved for special guests. I saw Stephanie stop in her tracks, her fake smile frozen on her face. I saw Derek emerge from the crowd, looking at me with an expression that was hard to read. They exchanged glances, clearly unsure how to proceed. Raymond led me to a seat at the head table directly next to his own chair. He introduced me to the other guests at the table, local business leaders and politicians, as his good friend Marlon Evans. He told them I was one of the finest men he knew, a self-made success story, a man of integrity and honor. I could feel Stephanie's eyes boring into my back. I could imagine the rage building inside her, the humiliation of seeing the bankrupt old man she had rejected, now seated at her father's right hand. The dinner was excellent, though I barely tasted it. I was too aware of the dynamics at play, the silent battle being waged across the room. Derek and Stephanie sat at a different table several yards away, but I could feel their discomfort radiating like heat from a fire. After the meal, Raymond stood to give a speech. He thanked everyone for coming, told a few jokes, accepted the well wishes with grace and humor. Then his tone became more serious. He started talking about family, about what it means to be a father, a husband, a man. He talked about his own father, who had died when Raymond was young, and how that loss had shaped him. He talked about the importance of respecting your elders, honoring those who came before you, remembering where you came from. Then he looked directly at me. He said he wanted to tell a story about a man he admired greatly. A man who had started with nothing and built something remarkable. A man who had lost his wife and raised his son alone, never complaining, never asking for help. A man who had given everything to his child, sacrificing his own comfort and happiness so that his son could have a better life. The room was silent now. Everyone was watching Raymond, following his gaze to where I sat. Raymond said that this man had recently fallen on hard times. Through no fault of his own, he had lost his business, his home, everything he had worked for. And when he turned to his son for help, his son had turned him away. I heard gasps from the audience. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Derek's face turn white. Raymond's voice grew harder. He said that a man who abandons his father is not worthy of respect. He said that family means standing by each other in good times and bad, not just when it is convenient or profitable. He said that he was ashamed, deeply ashamed of certain people in this room who had forgotten that basic truth. He did not name Derek directly. He did not need to. Everyone in the room knew exactly who he was talking about. Then Raymond turned to me. He said that Marlon Evans was welcome in his house any time. He said that from this day forward he considered me a member of his family. He raised his glass in a toast, and the room followed suit, dozens of voices echoing his words. I looked across the room at Derek. His head was bowed. Stephanie was gripping his arm, her face twisted with fury and embarrassment. They had been publicly called out, shamed in front of their peers by her own father. After the toast, Raymond sat down beside me. He leaned close and spoke quietly so only I could hear. He apologized for what his daughter had done. He said he had raised her better than that, and he did not know where she had learned such cruelty. He said he wanted to help me get back on my feet, to make up in some small way for the injustice I had suffered. I thanked him sincerely. His words meant more than he could know. For the first time in months, I felt like a human being again, not a piece of garbage to be discarded and forgotten. But I also told him that I could not accept charity. I had never taken a handout in my life, and I was not going to start now. I would rebuild on my own terms through my own efforts. That was the only way I could look at myself in the mirror. Raymond nodded slowly. He said he understood. He said he respected my pride, even if he thought it was misplaced. But he insisted that if I ever needed anything at all, his door was open. We shook hands. It was a deal and agreement between two men who understood each other. As I left the party that night, I walked past Derek and Stephanie's table. They did not look up. They did not say a word. The silence between us was deafening. But I was okay with that silence. I had said everything I needed to say, simply by showing up, by refusing to be erased, by standing tall in the face of their rejection. The night air was cold as I walked back to the bus stop. But I did not feel cold. I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Hope. The months that followed were the hardest of my life, but also the most transformative. After the party, I made a decision. I was done feeling sorry for myself. I was done waiting for things to get better. I was going to make them better through sheer force of will if necessary. The first step was finding work. Not a handout, not charity, but honest work that I could be proud of. I called every contact I still had in the construction industry, every former colleague and competitor and supplier. Most of them did not answer. Some gave me polite rejections. But one, a man named Thomas Harper, who ran a small construction firm in the suburbs, agreed to meet with me. Thomas remembered me from the old days. He said Morrison Brothers Construction had been a good company, a company that did quality work. He said he had heard about what Marcus Webb had done to me, and he was sorry. He said he might have a position for me if I was willing to start at the bottom. I told him I would sweep floors if that was what it took. He laughed. He said he had something a little better in mind. The job was site supervisor at a small residential project. The pay was modest, a fraction of what I used to make, but it was honest money. More importantly, it was a foot in the door, a chance to prove myself again. I threw myself into the work with everything I had. I was first to arrive and last to leave. I caught errors before they became problems. I mentored the younger workers, sharing the knowledge I had accumulated over 3 decades. Thomas noticed. He promoted me to project manager after 3 months, then to operations director after 6. Meanwhile, I started taking on small jobs on the side. Handyman work, minor repairs, the kind of stuff that did not require a big crew or expensive equipment. I advertised on bulletin boards and community websites. Word got around. Before long, I had more work than I could handle by myself. I reconnected with some of my former employees, the ones who had been loyal to me until the bitter end. A few of them were looking for work. I hired them, paying them out of my own pocket, building a team, one person at a time. 1 year after hitting rock bottom, I registered a new company with the state. I called it Second Chance Construction. The name said everything about what this venture meant to me. The early days were lean. We took whatever work we could get, no matter how small or unglamorous. We built decks and patched roofs and renovated basements. We worked long hours for thin margins, reinvesting every dollar back into the business. But gradually, word spread. Second Chance Construction did good work. Second Chance Construction treated its employees fairly. Second Chance Construction could be trusted to deliver on time and on budget. The jobs got bigger. The contracts got more lucrative. The team grew from 5 people to 10, then 15, then 20. 2 years after starting over, I was able to rent a small office and a storage yard. 2.5 years after that, I bought a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing fancy, just 2 bedrooms and a small yard. But it was mine. Bought with my own money, earned through my own labor. I thought about Derek sometimes. I wondered if he knew how far I had come, if he had heard about my new company, if he regretted his decision. But I did not reach out to him, and he did not reach out to me. The silence between us had become permanent, a wall that neither of us seemed willing to breach. Then one rainy evening my phone rang. I did not recognize the number, but I answered anyway. The voice on the other end was familiar, though I had not heard it in years. It was Derek. His voice was different from how I remembered it. Smaller, humbler. There was none of the arrogance I had sensed during our last encounter. None of the dismissive coldness. He sounded like a man who had been humbled by life. He asked if we could meet. He said he needed to talk to me. He said he had things he needed to say. I told him to meet me at a coffee shop near my house. He agreed. The next day, I sat in a booth by the window, nursing a cup of black coffee and watching the rain fall outside. Derek arrived 10 minutes late, which was unlike him. He had always been punctual, almost obsessively so. But he looked like a man who had bigger things on his mind than punctuality. He sat down across from me. He did not order anything. For a long moment, he just looked at me, and I looked back at him, and neither of us spoke. Then he started talking. He told me that Stephanie had filed for divorce. The marriage had been falling apart for years, he said, held together by nothing but habit and the fear of public embarrassment. She had found someone else, a colleague at her firm, and she was leaving Derek for him. The divorce was ugly. Stephanie wanted half of everything, including the house they had just bought. The legal fees were astronomical. Derek had been forced to liquidate most of his assets just to keep up. Then the bank had restructured. His department was eliminated. His corner office, his fancy title, his 6-figure salary, all of it gone overnight. He was broke. He was alone. He was, in a word, ruined. I listened to his story without interrupting. When he finished, the coffee shop was quiet except for the rain against the windows. I asked him why he was telling me this. He looked down at his hands. He said he wanted to apologize. He said he had been wrong, terribly wrong, to turn me away when I needed him. He said Stephanie had manipulated him, convinced him that I was a burden, a liability, a threat to their comfortable life. He had believed her because it was easier than standing up to her, easier than doing the right thing. He said he was ashamed of the man he had become. He said he missed his father. He said he was sorry. I sat with those words for a while. Sorry. Such a small word to carry such a heavy weight. I told Derek that I forgave him. I meant it. Carrying around bitterness and resentment was exhausting, and I was too old and too tired for that kind of burden. What he had done was wrong, deeply wrong, but he was still my son. He was still the baby I had held in my arms, the boy I had raised, the young man I had sent off into the world. That bond could not be erased, no matter how badly it had been strained. But I also told him that forgiveness did not mean forgetting. I would always remember what he had done. I would always carry the scar of that night in the rain, standing on his doorstep while his wife called me bad luck. Trust once broken could not be easily repaired. Derek nodded. He understood. He did not expect things to go back to the way they were. He just wanted a chance to start over to prove that he could be a better man. I thought about it for a moment. Then I made him an offer. I told him that my company was growing. I needed reliable workers. If he was willing to start at the bottom, to learn the trade, to work hard, and prove himself, I would give him a job. He looked at me like I had just offered him a lifeline, which in a way I had. He asked if I was serious. I told him I had never been more serious in my life. He accepted on the spot. The next Monday, Derek showed up at one of my job sites. He was wearing work boots and jeans and a plain t-shirt. His hands, which had never held anything heavier than a briefcase, were about to learn the feel of hammers and saws and bags of concrete. The other workers looked at him curiously. Some of them knew who he was. A few of them had been there when I was forced to close Morrison Brothers, when my son was living large in Philadelphia while I slept in a shelter. They did not say anything, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. Derek saw it too, but he did not complain. He did not ask for special treatment. He just put his head down and got to work. The first few weeks were rough. Derek was soft, out of shape, unused to physical labor. His hands blistered. His muscles ached. He made mistakes that cost time and money. More than once, I saw him struggling to keep up, his face red with exertion and frustration. But he did not quit. Every morning he showed up on time. Every evening he stayed until the work was done. Slowly, painfully, he began to improve. The other workers noticed. They started to respect him grudgingly at first, then more genuinely. He was not just the boss's son anymore. He was one of them. 3 years have passed since that day in the coffee shop. Second Chance Construction is thriving. We have 40 employees now, a fleet of trucks contracts that would have seemed unimaginable when I was sleeping in my car. I am not a rich man, but I am comfortable. More importantly, I am proud of what I have built, this second act that rose from the ashes of my first. Derek is still with the company. He worked his way up from laborer to foreman, earning every promotion through sweat and dedication. He is not the same man who turned me away on that rainy night. He has been humbled by life, shaped by struggle, refined by hardship. In many ways, he reminds me of myself at his age. Our relationship has healed, though it will never be the same as it was before. We eat dinner together every Sunday, just the two of us at my little house in the suburbs. We talk about work, about life, about Linda, and how much we both miss her. We do not talk about Stephanie or the divorce or the night at the door. Some wounds are better left undisturbed. I have also maintained my friendship with Raymond. He retired from the car business last year and spends his days fishing and playing golf. We get together once a month, two old men swapping stories and complaining about our aching joints. He has become something like a brother to me, filling a void I did not even know I had. Looking back on everything that happened, I have learned some hard truths. The first truth is that the people who should love you the most can sometimes hurt you the deepest. This is not a reason to stop loving. It is simply a fact of life, a risk we take when we open our hearts to others. The second truth is that rock bottom is not the end. It can be the beginning if you choose to see it that way. I lost everything, and in losing everything, I found out who I really was. Not a businessman, not a homeowner, not even a father. Just a man stripped down to his essence, forced to confront the core of his being. And what I found at that core was strength I did not know I had. The third truth, and this is the most important one, is that bitterness is a poison you drink while hoping someone else will die. I could have spent the rest of my life hating Derek, hating Stephanie, hating Marcus Webb and the bank and everyone else who contributed to my downfall. But what would that have accomplished? It would have eaten me alive, consumed every good thing in my life, left me a bitter and broken shell. Instead, I chose to let it go. Not all at once. Forgiveness is not a switch you flip. It is a process, a daily decision to release the anger and embrace the peace. Some days are harder than others, but I keep making that choice over and over because the alternative is too terrible to contemplate. I am sitting in my living room as I tell you this story. The sun is setting outside my window, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. My house is quiet, but it is not empty. It is filled with memories, good and bad triumphs and failures, losses and redemptions. It is filled with the evidence of a life fully lived. I am Marlon Evans. I am 61 years old now. I have lost everything twice, and twice I have rebuilt. I have known betrayal and forgiveness, despair and hope, the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human kindness. And I am at peace. If you lost everything tomorrow, who would open their door for you? Think about that question. Really think about it. Look around at the people in your life, the ones you take for granted, the ones you assume will always be there. Would they stand by you in your darkest hour? Would you stand by them? And here is the harder question: whose door would you open? If someone you loved showed up broken and desperate on your doorstep, would you let them in? Or would you find excuses, reasons to turn them away, ways to convince yourself that their problems were not your responsibility? Family is not about blood. It is about choice. It is about showing up day after day, year after year, no matter how hard it gets. It is about being the kind of person others can depend on and surrounding yourself with people who will do the same for you. I learned that lesson the hard way. I hope you do not have to. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever faced betrayal from someone you trusted? How did you find your way back? Share your experience so that others who are going through similar struggles know they are not alone. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you have not already subscribed to this channel, so you do not miss future stories of resilience, redemption, and the unbreakable human spirit. May you always have a door to open, and may you always have the courage to open it. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other.